Thank you all for coming out. Whether you've been a regular to my history lectures so far this year, or whether you're part of Awakening and you're new to our lectures tonight, I really thank all of you for coming out. Now, for those of you who have been traveling with me either since January or at least last month, know that I have started the last few sessions in prayer from Bishop John Carroll, the prayer that he wrote in praying for our new nation, praying particularly at the time of Washington's inauguration. But I decided to shift focus today for our opening prayer to focus more in line with our topics today on Daughters of the Church, Catholic Women Who Shaped America. So this prayer is going to come from one of these great Catholic women particularly. It's a prayer by St. Frances Cabrini, and it's her prayer of surrender to Jesus. So those of you who have been following along with Father Estock over the years might appreciate this prayer particularly. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. My loving Jesus, I enclose myself in you and surrender myself completely in your loving heart. Enlighten my mind with the ray of your light. Move my heart and soul, and make me do whatever pleases you and is for your greater glory. Jesus, I love you so much, but I am so weak that in my ignorance and sinfulness, I still do not know how to correspond, even partially, to all the special graces and loving tenderness with which you surround me. I will think of you and rest in you, my beloved Jesus. Behold your servant. Do with me whatever you want. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So as we go through tonight, this is a great opportunity for us to take a little bit of a step back. So for those of you who have joined me since January, you remember we've been making our way along through the history of the Catholic Church in America, and we started in January all the way from 1492, and then last month in February we got up to around the year 1800 or so, the turn of the century after the founding of the United States. But as we go through the year, we're going to be stopping along the way to do different typological discussions and talks, and so this is the first one in that part as well, but we'll return to the chronological history soon enough. Now, as those of you, again, who are with me in the beginning remember, I started off by giving you lots of different resources to go to if you were to look up history of the American Church. And just the same, there's some great resources out there if you want to dive deeper into the history and role of women in the Catholic Church in America. First of them is probably, now it might be a little bit outdated, it was written in 1990, so there's 35 years of history that aren't written in this book. But first off is The History of American Catholic Women by James Keneally. It's a great kind of single volume look from the colonial period all the way up to post-Vatican II, and it touches on a lot of women that I won't be able to touch on today because there's just so many great women and great people to talk about along the way. So that's a great single volume just on that topic. Another great book that when I picked it up a number of years ago, I couldn't put it down. It's this book called Sisters by John Fialka. It's a beautiful story, or it's not a story, it's all true, but beautiful rendition and showing of the history and role of women religious in the United States. And great kind of stories that you would never be able to hear anywhere else. I don't know where he collects them all from. He's a Wall Street Journal reporter, so he has a great writing style as well that I think is very easy to follow along with and tells a great story. Now, kind of an interesting niche book in this category, and I don't even remember how I came across it or how I even got a copy of it, is The Guide to the Catholic Sisterhoods in the United States. It is literally a page-by-page description of all the different religious orders in the United States. They each get a page, and then it tells you, a little bit of their history, what qualifications a young aspirant might need if they want to enter this congregation, what their habit is, and who to contact if they want to enter the vocational life. So I don't know if it was originally put out as kind of a vocational guide, but it is certainly a great historical artifact to see different women religious, what they wore, and kind of what ministries they were involved in. And you might realize quickly as we're going along that much of the written history, much of what we know of the role of women in American Catholicism comes through the women religious. And that's because of their institutional role. And so there's been a lot more written about them in particular that maybe isn't touched on for lay women. But Keneally touches on plenty in his single volume. Another great kind of single book about women religious is called Called to Serve, kind of more in-depth in a particular historical period of the 19th and early 20th century, is New Women of the Old Faith, kind of comparing and contrasting kind of women of the day and women religious. And then kind of looking at post-Vatican II, there's Recovering Their Stories, U.S. Catholic Women in the 20th Century. So a much more modern and post-Vatican II approach to women's roles and the stories that they can tell along the way. So those are just some of the resources, and I have some of them up here if you want to take a look at them afterwards or when we take our short break later on. But kind of diving right into it, as I said, the history of American Catholic women is easily divided between women religious, nuns, sisters, consecrated women, and lay women. And as I said, much of the written history, most of the stories that we receive are from the religious sisters. Again, because of their role in the institution, because of, as their place in the church, they just naturally kept and shared stories, had archives, had correspondence, had structure that they were able to work in, particularly in times when regular lay women were not able to do this kind of work. And both groups of women were able to work in countless and numerous different fields. We can think of the historical, maybe more general roles for women in nursing and hospitals and education, but I think we all know well that the role of women religious and of lay women goes far beyond that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention kind of the danger of double discrimination that many women faced, both as Catholics, as we've been talking about the last several months. J.P. Dolan says that the greatest, or John Tracy Ellis rather, says that the most ingrained prejudice in America is anti-Catholicism. And probably behind that in our history has been kind of discrimination of women. And so when they were trying to go out and do new things, both religious and lay women, all throughout the centuries, they've had this kind of uphill battle that they've had to face. But they have been and continue to be extremely influential, and particularly they go unrecognized even in the history books. As I mentioned, there's a few books that I pointed out that speak to the history of women religious and lay women. But if you read the vast majority of books on American Catholic history, women are more often than not, unfortunately, a footnote or a passing comment about who's doing what or what sisters founded a school and whatnot. but really they play an important role. And I think part of that maybe unspoken role that they play, even though it has great recognition, is that we can say that 7 out of the 11 American saints are women. Now, there's 11 saints that are associated with or from America, from the United States, and 7 out of the 11 are women. I think that points to the sanctity that these women obviously had, and the role and influence that they had and continue to have in society, both in the church and outside of the church. So first, we're going to dive into a little bit of a history of women religious in the United States. And there's a lot to cover and a lot of different things to talk about. Like I said, this could be split up into multiple different lectures and could go on in great detail, great stories. So I'm going to do my best to share at least a snapshot of many of the great highlights that we can see from all women in this history of American Catholicism. So we look, as you might recall from our previous talks, back to Maryland, to Port Tobacco, Maryland, as it is called, is a small town in Maryland on the Chesapeake, on the Potomac rather, that became the home of the first monastery in the United States. In the newly found country of the United States, the Carmelites, the Order of Carmel Discalced, the same order as St. Therese of Lisieux, St. Teresa of Avila. This monastery was founded in 1790, and you can still go and visit it today. I had the opportunity to visit it a few years ago when I was visiting family in Maryland. And they have kind of a historical reconstruction of their original convent, original chapel, and that's what's pictured there. It looks much nicer than I'm sure it obviously was, but it was really just a small single room downstairs and upstairs, and really showed the poverty that they were coming into, but the great work they were able to build and the great seeds they were able to be in the new United States. So what's interesting is that normally most of the religious orders and religious communities in the United States were founded by Europeans who were coming over to the United States because they were either asked by bishops, they were asked by priests to come over to help with different ministries. But 3 of the 4 sisters who founded this Carmel are American. One of them, or the mother, the leader of them, was Mother Bernardina Matthews. She was born in the colonies here in Maryland, and she wanted to enter religious life, and the only place to do that was back in the old world. So she went to Belgium, where she entered the Carmel, and soon enough, 2 of her nieces followed after her and became sisters as well and traveled with her back to the United States. Sister Mary Aloysia and Sister Mary Eleonora. So together, these 3 family members, along with their Belgian sister, Sister Claire Joseph, really started the seeds of women religious in the United States. Certainly, they weren't the first Catholic women, that's for sure, as we've talked about the role of Catholics and the discrimination of Catholics in the colonies before. But they really became the seed and kind of the future-looking focus as more religious groups quickly appeared on the scene. Now, right around the same time or a little bit later, we have the appearance of our first saint, or first natural citizen of the United States, which is St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. She was born in 1774 in New York to a somewhat pretty well-to-do family. Her husband, William, they married in 1794, and he was a successful businessman in the new United States. But very quickly, his luck ran out. They lost all that they had, and so he quickly became sick, and the doctors said, go to Europe. This was a common thing in those days. go to Europe, go to the fresh air in Italy and France, and you'll be better. Well, he dies in 1803 with Elizabeth there with him in Italy and their children. And so she is really stuck in a foreign land, not really knowing what to do, her only contact being his Italian business partners. And it was there that she first had an encounter with Catholicism. She was born into a Protestant family, and it was just a few years later in 1806 that she became Catholic. She was confirmed, entered the church under Bishop John Carroll, remember, our first Catholic bishop here in the United States. And very quickly, she had a heart for the poor. She had a heart for working and doing great things. And so she founded the first congregation of sisters in America, first American congregation, the Sisters of Charity, or as they're referred to now, the Sisters of Charity of New York in 1809. Now, unfortunately, just a couple years ago, the Sisters of Charity of New York announced that they were not going to be accepting any more applications from women to enter their community. So they, as they've said, they're kind of in the process of closing their apostolate, closing their ministry, and handing it on to others. But so for over 200 years, they have and they continue to be great leaders, particularly among the poor and in education. She died in 1821 and was canonized in 1975. Now, as we go through the history, I'm going to do my best to not just simply give you names, facts, death date, name, facts, death date, name, facts, death date. But really, it is important to look at these individuals. So bear with me if it gets a little dry. Now, the first American, she was a naturalized citizen of the United States. The first American to be canonized was St. Frances Xavier Cabrini. She was born in Italy in 1850, and she entered religious life there. She grew up in a very pious, very faithful family in Italy, entered religious life, and after entering a religious community and founding a new congregation in Rome, she went to the Pope because she had a great desire to be a missionary, to send sisters off to Asia to do great ministry. And she asked Pope Leo XIII for his blessing. And Pope Leo famously tells her, I don't want you to go to the East, I want you to go to the West, to the New World, to the United States, to New York City. Because he knew that there were so many Italian immigrants in that area that were being disparaged, that were very poor, that needed education and needed assistance. So she goes to the United States in 1887. Now, has anyone seen the movie about Cabrini? Yeah, it's a very good movie. I really suggest it. It just came out, a year or two ago, I think. Beautiful movie, goes into much more detail about her life that I can't. It talks about her arguments and quarrels with the bishop in New York and kind of the struggles that she had in this new congregation, new country, kind of new atmosphere. But what I can say is that she worked so many great things among the poor, particularly the poor Italians. And so she founded this congregation, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And from there, the community grew, not just in the United States, but in Italy and continuing around the world. So that by the time she died, she had established 67 schools, orphanages, or other institutions throughout the world, in Italy and in the United States. And her sisters continued to spread her charity, her desire to serve the poor all over the world. Like I said, she was the first American to be canonized in 1946, and she was named the patron saint of immigrants because she herself was an immigrant. She worked with the Italian immigrants, and she really is that great example of caring for the poor, for the outcast, for those so often thrown aside by society. Now, kind of as I said, there are seven women saints in American Catholicism, and kind of the three heavy hitters, we've hit two of them already. And the third of them would be St. Catherine Drexel. She was born in the United States in Philadelphia, and she was born to a very wealthy family. Maybe you've probably heard of Drexel University in Philadelphia. It was not named after her. It was opened by her uncle, who was also a very wealthy Drexel, and her family had historical ties to many wealthy and politically influential families. But Catherine, at a very young age, wanted to serve the poor, wanted to do great things for people. She grew up in that generation of not only Catholics, but also Protestants, that those who had wealth, those who were well off, knew that they had an obligation to care for the poor, to care for the common good of society. And so she really desired to do that, along with the philanthropy of her family members as well. But she was trying to figure out how she wanted to do this in her life. So very similar to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, she went to Rome and she met with the same pope as St. Francis Xavier Cabrini. She met with Leo XIII, who really encouraged her and desired to be a missionary. But much like his encouragement to Cabrini, he encouraged Catherine Drexel to return to the United States, to be a missionary there among her own people, to really set up herself, to set up a community, to set up a movement in society for greater care and support for the poor. And so she goes back to the United States. She establishes the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament in 1891. And this congregation has a great history, because her main focus of this congregation wasn't simply the poor in Philadelphia or the poor in New York City or the poor in some big city, but she wanted to go out to the fringes and frontiers of America. She wanted to go to the rural South, to the frontiers of the West, to serve the Native Americans and the African Americans in those areas. And so she went out and she established countless convents and missions and groups, and her sisters spread all throughout the United States. Community of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament were here in Cleveland, at Blessed Sacrament Church, I believe on the east side of Cleveland. And when they were laying the cornerstone, Catherine Drexel herself came with her to support her community as they were laying the foundation stone for that church. So we have photos of her visiting Cleveland as well. And as I said, she traveled extensively to open, and not only to open these communities, but as the Mother Superior, she traveled countless miles on horseback, on trains, by stagecoach to get to the communities to do visits. She was almost never sitting still. She was relentless in her energy, and when she died in 1955, she had been the Mother Superior. She stopped being the Mother Superior in the 30s. So for 40 years, she was the Mother Superior. But even in her retirement, she was still traveling so much. She was still writing many letters to her sisters, encouraging them in their ministry. And then she was canonized in the Jubilee year of 2000 by Pope John Paul II. So these three mothers, these three sisters, these three saints, St. Catherine Drexel, St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, and St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, are probably the three most well-known of the American saints, if not just the American female saints. But there's three others that were religious women that maybe we haven't heard as much about, that we're not as familiar with. First of these sisters is around the same time as Elizabeth Ann Seton. Her name is St. Rose Philippine Duquesne. She was born in France in 1769, where she entered the Society of Religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, very similar to the name of St. Francis Xavier Cabrini's community. But what's so interesting about her is that she entered she entered her religious order in the 1780s, kind of right around her 18th birthday. And so she was in the convent. She was a religious sister at the time of the French Revolution. And if you know anything about world history or anything about French history, you know that the French Revolution was particularly harsh against religious women. There's the famous Carmelites who were going to be killed by the guillotine, and they knelt before their Mother Superior, asking her permission for them to die. Well, St. Rose obviously was not killed in the French Revolution, so it's kind of a miracle that she was able to survive and get out of her convent. And after the revolution was over, after Napoleon came to power, she came to the United States. And very similar to St. Catherine Drexel, she too had a desire to serve the Native Americans, caring for and educating them, setting up schools, particularly in Missouri, outside of St. Louis and the surrounding areas, because many of the Native Americans were being kicked out of their lands in Florida, along the East Coast, west of the Appalachians, and so they were being pushed out by the Indian Removal Acts past the Mississippi River. So she was there in Missouri, caring for, along with the community of sisters that she brought with her, caring for these people who the rest of society were kind of throwing to the side, not caring much about and treating so harshly. The next saintly sister would be Saint Theodore Guerin. She was born in France as well in 1798, so she was spared the sufferings of the French Revolution as a sister. But she was a religious sister in France. She entered in close to her hometown. And as bishops so often did in the new United States, new bishops would come to their dioceses. They would see that there were no religious women, there were no schools, there was no infrastructure. So they went back to Europe seeking sisters who would be able to come with them as missionaries, come with them to help spread the gospel in the New World. And part of her convent, or her Mother Superior of her convent, elected St. Theodora and other sisters to go with her, and she ended up establishing the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods in Indiana. And she had a tremendous role in education there, because they established schools for girls and for women, and they established the first Catholic, not the first Catholic women's, but the first Catholic college in Indiana, even before Notre Dame was founded. 1 year before Notre Dame was founded by the Holy Cross priests, she established St. Mary of the Woods College. And so it really stands as a testament not only to the parochial schools or the small academies that many sisters established, but she had a great historical role in Catholic education in the whole state of Indiana, and very much so in the United States still. And so another sidestep, I was able to go and see her shrine at St. Mary of the Woods in Indiana. It's not a far drive outside of St. Louis. And it's a beautiful area, and there they have her remains, her relics, and it's a beautiful grounds, and really easy to get a sense of why they called it St. Mary of the Woods, because even still it's in the middle of the woods, and it really is a far-off place. And the last of these saints that I'm going to talk about for now is St. Mary Ann Cope. As opposed to the two French sisters, she was born in Germany in 1838. And she is so well known as the companion of St. Damien of Molokai, another great American saint St. Damien traveled to Hawaii, to the island of Molokai, which was established as a leper colony. And there he ministered to the poor, to the lepers who were kind of thrown off, were shipped there to get rid of them. We think of leprosy in the Bible as an ancient thing, but they were still dealing with it in the 19th century. And so when she entered the Franciscan Sisters of Syracuse in New York, she had no idea what God was going to do with her, where she was going to travel. But she heard of the stories of these leper colonies in Hawaii. She heard of the stories of Damien, who was still alive at her time. And so she and a group of women from her community traveled to Hawaii. You can only imagine what the travel would have been like back then, from Syracuse in upstate New York to Hawaii, traveling 3/4 of the way plus across the continental US, and then getting on a boat and having to travel to Hawaii, all to care for the lepers in this community who she had never met, who she had heard only stories of. And when she arrived in Molokai, Father Damien had already contracted leprosy. He was still doing what he could to care for the people there in his priestly ministry, but she cared for him on his deathbed, and she was lucky enough to not succumb and never even catch leprosy herself, but she continued to serve there in Hawaii among the lepers until her death in 1918, when she was buried in Hawaii, and that's where her major shrine, that's where her relics are in the cathedral in Honolulu. And she was canonized, interestingly, in October of 2012 at the same canonization as St. Kateri Tekakwitha, who I'll go into a little bit later on. So that kind of gives us a nice broad look of these saintly religious sisters. But there's also great stories, great examples of heroic women, heroic religious sisters who did so much throughout the United States. Again, kind of looking historically, we go back to 1727, to the establishment of the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, when it was still just a colony. And similar to many of the other religious women that we've talked about so far, they worked greatly for the education of girls and young women. They established a great school, a great academy there. And interestingly enough, when the Louisiana Purchase occurred and that territory became part of the United States, you can only imagine the dread that these sisters might have had. They were French or Spanish sisters. They were Catholic. They were women. They were unsure of what this new United States was going to do with the convent. So they wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, to President Jefferson, asking him to assure them of their safety, that they would be able to keep their convent, that they would be able to continue in their ministry. And he writes back and does exactly that. So he did. He was able to assure them of his protection, that they would be able to continue. This is the letter of Thomas Jefferson to the sisters in New Orleans. I have received, Holy Sisters, the letter which you have written to me. The principles of the Constitution and government of the United States are a sure guarantee to you that it will be preserved to you sacred and inviolate, and that your institution will be permitted to govern itself according to its own voluntary rules, without interference from civil authority. We might think of that as, pretty cut and dry these days, but you can imagine for a group of women, a group of Catholics who are running schools, who are running other institutions in the city, that there was some fear that the government was going to come in. They were going to say, all right, you can't run your school anymore, you can't run your orphanage anymore, we'll let you stay sisters, you can keep your convent, but we're going to take all these other things from you. But Thomas Jefferson assures them that they're not going to lose any of their property, any of their ministry. But this is not the end of the Ursuline Sisters of New Orleans in American history, because Interestingly enough, they had a role to play in the War of 1812. When Andrew Jackson was in New Orleans fighting against the British invasion in New Orleans, the fleet that had been sent from their colonies, he put the whole city on lockdown, whole city on notice, and the sisters gathered the Catholic community around them and began to pray. They held all-night vigils that the city would be spared, that the people would be protected, and that the United States would be victorious. And that's exactly what happened. So Andrew Jackson had a crew of 4,700 men, and when the British invaded, he was able to completely wipe out the British forces in just under 30 minutes. He was able to, and they lost less than 100 men in the battle, which Andrew Jackson saw as a great memorial, a great miracle that happened. And so after the victory, he actually went with other American forces. He went with the Bishop of New Orleans, who was also in St. Louis, and he went and attended a Catholic Mass there in thanksgiving, offering up his prayers and his thanks to God, and particularly commemorating the sisters. And when he became president after the war, he returned to New Orleans, and every time he returned to New Orleans, he was sure to visit the sisters, to thank them for their prayers, to thank them for their help in the success, and they promised to continue to pray for him. And so every year they still hold a Mass praying for Andrew Jackson. It speaks to the power of prayer and speaks to even what could be said as a simple community of religious women were able to do such great things. But these aren't the only great stories that can be told of women religious. As I said, this great book called Sisters by John Fialka is full of works and stories and tremendous things that these women did all throughout the United States, all throughout the centuries, not only in the 18th or 19th century, but even in the 20th century as well. And they had influence on all areas of Catholic and even non-Catholic life. For example, in his book, he speaks about the founding of different communities, different congregations and convents in the West, in the wild, wild West, we might say. And he speaks of a group of religious who were founding a convent in Omaha. Now, today we might think of Omaha as, okay, it's farm country, what could happen there? But back in the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, Omaha was, part of the frontier. And so when the group of women, when seven sisters arrived in 1864, they found what they thought was going to be a well-kept and well-provided for convent for them that the bishop had promised them. But they found an empty brick building with barren walls, barren floors, with simply a stove and a piano. That's all that they had when they arrived in Omaha. But to speak to not only the sentiment of Catholics, but the wider sentiment of the community, and for those who recall the stories of anti-Catholicism, this is particularly telling. The Nebraskan newspaper at the time said that the sisters, looked forward to everything that the sisters were going to do because Omaha had nothing besides a railroad and a large assortment of saloons, they said. That was Omaha. But the sisters are accomplished in every branch of science and will attract scores of young ladies from every portion of the West. They added that no one thing adds more to the importance of a place than the schools that the sisters will provide. No, it speaks to the great work that they were going to do. And when sisters moved from Omaha to Colorado, when the gold rush was going on, again, they kind of found similar circumstances. In an area filled with hundreds, if not thousands, of gold miners, men seeking their fortune, they found that the town that they went to, Cripple Creek, Colorado, to establish a convent, the town had, as they say, 73 saloons and gambling dens, but they had neither gotten around to building a school nor a hospital. So the very first thing that the sisters did was build a hospital, and it wasn't a day after building it that it was full to the brim. You know, maybe it speaks to when men are left alone and we're not going to build hospitals and schools. We're going to go digging in the ground for gold. I think that speaks to the feminine genius that we all need in our life. But the sisters continued to do great things. You know, there are great stories of their fearlessness, of their hope and their trust in God's providence in everything that they did. They showed the great reliance of our faith, are great examples of our faith to us, in trusting in God and in placing our providence in Him. You know, as I said, they went with really nothing, with maybe some books, with maybe some thoughts and ideas of what they were going to do, maybe some monetary donations from the bishop or other people, but they really had no idea of where it was going to lead them. And they worked everywhere from schoolhouses to battlefields. There's a story of sisters in the Civil War. And the sisters, you know, oftentimes when the battles were going on in the Civil War, there weren't always, but on occasion, there were convents nearby. And the sisters would leave their convents, would leave their cloisters where they had to stay, so that they would go out to the battlefields. They would go out and help these men who were dying, who were injured, and try to nurse them back to life. And one of them, a sister, Lucy Dosch, in 1861, in Paducah, Kentucky. I don't know where that is in Kentucky, but they had set up a makeshift field hospital to care for both Union and Confederate soldiers. And the sisters were going around so much caring for them that they weren't even caring for themselves. And Sister Lucy was famous for singing songs and being very, very caring and gracious with all of them. And all of a sudden, she fell ill and died because of caring for them and not looking after her own health. And in a field hospital filled with both Union and Confederate soldiers, they used that as an example to come together. The story is told that they formed a truce, and an honor guard of both sides took her body to the river where the riverboat was waiting to take her back to the convent. Guns fell silent as they accompanied her casket in a Navy boat up the Ohio River to Uniontown, Kentucky, where she was buried in the graveyard with her sisters. Her sacrifice and the soldiers' reflections about it, as Fialka says, became a theme that played over thousands of dinner tables after the war was over. For those who have been attending the previous lectures, it's been so easy to point out the anti-Catholic sentiments that are voracious throughout American history, particularly in the first century and a half or two. But the religious women did so much to break through those barriers, to break through those prejudices, that really we must wonder where we would be as Catholics, where we would be in relation to the rest of our nation if it wasn't for them. And the last story of the sisters I'm going to share before we take a short break is the story of the sister pictured here, Sister Blandina. And she was a sister again in the wild, wild West. And she is famous for having come across a certain cowboy, a certain outlaw by the name of Billy the Kid. And the story goes that when she was ministering in Trinidad, Colorado, Billy the Kid and his crew came through to save one of their men who was up to be hung. And Sister was there caring for him, caring for his spiritual needs beforehand. And they saved him, but in retribution to the town, they were going to scalp the only four doctors that the town had. And when the man told Billy the Kid about Sister's work in caring for him and how much she was gracious to him, Billy told her that he would allow her one favor, and all she asked for was that he not scalp the doctors, that he spare their life and continue on in their work. And as the story goes, Billy the Kid grinned, said yes, and the doctors kept their hair. But Billy the Kid, as we might be familiar, did not go on to change his life to convert to Catholicism by any means. He was certainly still an outlaw, certainly still a figure of great stories and troublesome things throughout the West. But it speaks again to the gentleness, to the care, to the ability of these sisters to break into areas where other people were unable to go. It speaks to their great courage, their great desire for virtue, their great desire to follow God's will. So like I said, there are numerous stories of different sisters, and I just want to quickly go through three more sisters before we get to the role of lay women, which is just as important. But a little bit of a local connection is Sister Ignatia and her role in the founding of AA, of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you're not familiar with Sister Ignatia, again, there's a book about her that you can go and read, a biography of her life. But she was born in Ireland in the late 1800s, in 1889. But she entered the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine here in the United States after she emigrated to the United States, and that's the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine in Akron, Ohio. And she was very, very much involved with the care of alcoholics at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, where AA was founded and it was established. In fact, she was really renowned, I believe, as a great leader and great minister and great administrator of the hospital. And so she was kind of running a lot of things. And so when it came time to work with the doctors who were really establishing the rules of AA and the whole program, she took in the first patients, the first men who were going through the program. And she is often referred to as the angel of hope among Alcoholics Anonymous, because she did so much work. Again, as I've said before, she brought that feminine care that the male doctors obviously had care, obviously had interest in caring for these people with the addiction, but her care and the care of the sisters there in Akron just made the program really all the more what it is now, and was really able to help it get it off its feet. Another local connection is Mother Angelica. It wouldn't be a talk about women in the Catholic Church in America without good old Mother Angelica. She was born in Canton in 1923. Maybe you know much about her story already. She first entered religious life here in Cleveland at the Poor Clare Monastery at St. Paul's Shrine in downtown Cleveland. And of course, we know much of the rest of her story. She moved down to the new convent in Canton. Then she felt God's call to do more. She ended up founding EWTN in 1981. and she died just recently in Alabama in 2016. Hard to believe that it's 10 years now since she has passed. But she continues, through her reruns of her Mother Angelica Live that still airs on EWTN. She still holds an influence. In fact, I've talked to more than one person, not here, who, because her reruns are always on, because she's still speaking many things that are pertaining to modern life, some people think that she's still alive. Think that Mother Angelica Live is still live, not so much. And the last of the religious sisters that I want to touch on is really a very unique and interesting story. So it's called The Abbey of Regina Laudis. And one of my other special books over here, I picked this book up a few years ago, and again, it's a biography, so if you don't like biographies, don't bother. But it's still an interesting story and great reflection on the life of Mother Benedict Duss, who founded this abbey. So it was founded by Mother Benedict Duss in Bethlehem, Connecticut in 1947, so just after the Second World War. But what's interesting about her story is that she was born in America. She was born, and her family didn't want her to become a nun here in the United States because they felt like she had so much promise, so much educational promise, so much promise as going into being a doctor or being an academic even at that time. So they sent her to France. And there she earned she got her degree in medicine, a degree to be a surgeon, a trained surgeon from the famous Sorbonne University in France in 1936. But after becoming a surgeon, after working briefly in the medical field, she still felt this call to enter religious life. So she entered a Benedictine monastery there in France, went through all the troubles of World War II. Her convent, her monastery there in France was liberated by American soldiers, and through dreams and other prayers and other intercessions, she realized that God was calling her to return to her home, to the nation, to return to the United States, and give as an act of praise and thanksgiving for their convent being saved, to establish a monastery in the United States. Because at the time, there really was no monastery like it at the time. There were Benedictine monasteries of men, obviously, here in Cleveland, Latrobe, Pennsylvania, St. Meinrad's, many male Benedictine monasteries, but female Benedictine monasteries never really got off the ground here in the United States. And she established this in Bethlehem, Connecticut in 1947, with little to nothing, with just a couple sisters, the gracious charity of a Protestant landowner there in Connecticut, giving her a tract of farmland, of woods. And, but this abbey that she founded had and continues to have great influence. As you saw just briefly, it was from this abbey, from this community, that the movie Come to the Stable was based off of in 1948 or 49, I forget exactly. And you see there the two leading roles of Loretta Young and Celeste Holm. I'm not much knowing into movies from the 40s, so I don't know if those are big names or not, but but I'm sure you can find the movie somewhere to enjoy it if you haven't seen it already. But she quickly wanted this to be a place of spiritual and intellectual encounter. Because of her training as a surgeon, because of the great education she had, she looked back in the history of the Benedictine order and saw that the first Benedictine monasteries for the first centuries of the Benedictines, they were self-sufficient. They were seen as centers of education, of intellectual life. They weren't simply there praying, but they were praying and working. The motto of St. Benedict, ora et labora, prayer and work. And so she wanted that to be the impetus of her community. So she wanted to gather around her other sisters, other mothers. They refer to themselves as mothers in a monastery. But she wanted to surround herself with other women who were also very successful in their fields, who were also well educated, so that they weren't relying upon others to do their monastic work. They wanted to be that light for other people to see, kind of a unique place. And so the community has numerous great accomplishments and well-trained people. Like I said, its founder, Mother Benedict, was a surgeon. Mother Maria Immaculata Materés was born as Anne Lucille Materés. She was a lawyer trained in the schools in Connecticut, and she was also a member of the Connecticut House of Representatives before entering the Abbey. Mother Noella Marcelino received a doctorate in microbiology, had a Fulbright scholarship to study fungi in France. And you want to guess how she's using that very well in her community? She's the cheese maker. So she went to France. She learned how these old French communities were making the best cheese in the world. She took samples of the fungus, brought it back to the U.S., and is now making cheese for the monastery, for themselves, but also to sell to help sustain the community. And another who you might be familiar with as well besides this movie is Mother Dolores Hart. She was an actress starring or playing with Elvis Presley in his first big movie. Now I'm going to blank on what that one was called. But her story was made into an HBO documentary, God is the Bigger Elvis, because she was a co-star with Elvis in this movie that she was an actress in, Dolores Hart. So again, this is just a snapshot of the role of women, and particularly this abbey I find to be interesting because of, it is so unique compared to a lot of the other active religious women that I talked about. They're not running a school, they're not running a hospital or an orphanage or other social work. They're there at their abbey praying, but they're working, and they're doing so many great things because they're surrounding themselves with great women, with strong women, with women who are ready to work in their field. Not seeing the convent not as a place to run away from the world, but as a place to use their gifts, to use their talents, always to the greater glory of God. So I'm still hoping to make it out there to Connecticut to visit them one day, and maybe even trying some cheese. And so maybe you're thinking, it's about time we get to out of the sisters and into the lay women. And if you feel like I've been lopsided in this, it's true. And as I said, most of the history is written about the sisters. But the lay women in the church have done so many great things, particularly in the last century. But just a little bit longer ago than the last century, we have our seventh female saint in American Catholic Church, St. Kateri Tekakwitha, who I spoke about in a previous talk. But as a recap, she was born in present-day New York in 1656, part of the Mohawk tribe. Her father was a Mohawk chief, and her mother, I believe, was an Algonquin Christian. She's referred to as the Lily of the Mohawks. And after becoming Catholic, after converting, she moved to a Jesuit mission outside of Montreal, where she devoted her life to prayer, her life to service there in the community, surrounded by other women from native tribes and also other Europeans. And it was there that she had a great desire to establish a religious order for Native American women. But the Jesuits at the time dissuaded her not to do so, that it wasn't the right time for the church, and it wasn't the right time for her. And it was probably in God's providence, because it seems that he had other plans for her, because she died relatively young in 1680 during Holy Week. And soon after her death, there were great miracles attributed to her, attributed not only to her grave, but also her appearing to some of the priests and some of her friends in the community. And so that's what this famous picture of St. Kateri Tekakwitha is. It's a painting by one of the Jesuit priests there who had seen her in a vision. And so this is supposed to be what he saw in his vision. But it took quite a long time, almost 350 years, for her to be canonized along, as I said, in October of 2012. But she really begins kind of this great wave of lay Catholic women having this influential role, not only in the church, but also in greater society. And particularly this next group of women have tremendous stories and more influence on society, on culture, on government than necessarily on the church. First of them is Margaret Brent. She was actually the executor of the desires, of the wishes, of the plans of Lord Baltimore, who, if you missed some of the other lectures, received the land grant from King James and established the colony of Maryland. So she was really the one who went to the United States, to the colony, who helped to make sure they were following what was going on. And she was adamant that she deserved 2 seats in the elected House there in Maryland for her to put in 2 of her own representatives to make sure her will and the will of Lord Baltimore were being followed. She was certainly a strong woman in doing all of that, especially at the time in the founding of Maryland Colony in the 1600s. Mary Digges Lee, again, was from Maryland. She was a wife of the second governor who had become the second governor of Maryland. And during the Revolution, she was famous for going around, particularly the well-off women in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, and collecting clothes and other supplies that were sent to soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And she had such an influential role that George Washington wrote her numerous letters thanking her for what she did and really commending her for her role in supplying the soldiers. Joanna England, whose brother was a bishop, became the editor of the first Catholic newspaper in the United States, the U.S. Catholic Miscellany. Doesn't really sound like that tantalizing of a newspaper, but it's all the miscellaneous things of U.S. Catholics, I guess. But she was an editor of the newspaper, again, at a time when women were not holding such high up positions in public or in private newspapers. And then the last of these women pictured here is Rose O'Neal Greenhow, and she was influential in the Civil War, but maybe not in the way that we expect or that we maybe would like to hear. She was a spy during the Civil War, but she was a spy, very successful spy for the Confederacy. So she was able to get into kind of high-to-do parties and social events in the Union government, and was able to send back information to the Confederacy. And she actually died after she had been caught as a spy, sent to prison, released, started spying again. Then the ship that she was on was blown up by the Union Navy, and she didn't survive. But nonetheless, a very influential woman in society at the time. And we could go on and on about different women. I guess I forgot to put a picture in. Oops. You can just look at and enjoy the coffee. You might need it to go through some of the politicians, you know. But some famous ones would be Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Justice Amy Coney Barrett of the current Supreme Court. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was the first woman to hold the position of Secretary of State, and she was a Catholic. You know, many of the ambassadors to the number of ambassadors to the Holy See, among other ambassadors, have been women, including Lindy Boggs, Marianne Glendon, and Callista Gingrich. And we can only name other members of Congress, past and present, who have been and continue to be influential, not only, or maybe not so much again in the church, but more so in the larger society in the role of government. Turning away for a moment from individuals to larger groups, I want to take a look at a couple of great societies, great groups that were founded by and for women to be influential in their own way. So the National Council of Catholic Women was founded in 1920 by Bishop Joseph Schrems in Toledo. But it was founded in this post-World War I era where there was great desire to do social work, to build groups and societies and these national councils. There were a number of national councils that were established by Catholics around the US. And when Bishop Schrems came to Cleveland the next year, he established the Cleveland Council in 1922. And it really began as an aid effort for immigrants who were coming over after the First World War, and to help in educating them and teaching them about life in America and other roles and responsibilities and caring for immigrants that so many of the others, particularly the religious women, were involved in. But they're still around. They haven't left their influential role. They work in tandem with the United States bishops to work in areas of social justice, vocational support, raising funds, and lots of money and donations for sisters or those who are in formation to be religious sisters, to help defer costs, to help pay off student loans that might be stopping them from entering religious life. And they do other kinds of charitable support all around the nation. Again, another group is called the Catholic Daughters of the Americas. Kind of it started as a bit of a female spin-off of the Knights of Columbus in 1903, along with another women's group called the Daughters of Isabella, who started a couple years before as spin-offs as female kind of spin-offs or auxiliaries of the Knights of Columbus. But they were very much involved in World War I, raising in money in that time, not even in our time, $3 million for the effort of sending soldiers care packages, sending supplies, making sure that things were provided for soldiers and their families back home. And they spread not only around the United States, but around the rest of the world. Hence why they changed their name from Catholic Daughters of America to Catholic Daughters of the Americas, because they've spread to Puerto Rico, to some other areas in Latin America, even all the way to Guam. And again, they continue to be influential. They're maybe not as large as the previous organization, but they continue to be influential in the March for Life, in establishing funds and raising support for aging religious, and other charitable works around associated with the poor, and again, working with American bishops for these special collections. So these two groups just point to some of the great work that that women were able to do together. But women weren't simply raising funds, doing nice things for the men who went off to war. They were doing plenty of their own influential works. And there's two particular Catholic writers that I want to point out. The first one is probably less well known. Her name is Helen C. White. She was an English professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she was a very successful English professor, very successful academic, receiving close to or around 24 honorary doctorates during her career, publishing countless works, and working in many different areas and being very successful in her own right. But she also wrote a number of Catholic novels, and they're very influenced by her Catholic faith. One is a historical novel of St. Francis called The Bird of Fire, about St. Francis. And she's written other historical novels dealing with the roles of Catholics and what it must have felt to be a Catholic in the 400s in Rome, in the time of the Crusades, in the midst of the French Revolution. She really had this great kind of historical novel mindset to be able to place a Catholic in the midst of those historical periods. And the second, probably more famous Catholic woman writer is Flannery O'Connor. She was a novelist, a story writer, having written 2 novels and a third being published posthumously, over 30 short stories, countless reflections, and really she had a great, if you've never read any of her work, sometimes it can be a little bit challenging because she has a very dark way of writing. On the surface, her works can appear very kind of dark, can appear hard or hopeless or brutal, as some people have described them. But she said that all of her stories are about the action of grace. And isn't in those times of darkness, in those times of hardship, that we really experience and need the gift of grace all the more? And so she's writing a lot of her stories are in those dark times because she herself went through a number of troubles. But she's trying to share that aspect of our faith, that grace is active in all parts of life, particularly in the hard times when we might not see it, but when we need it all the more. Now, there's 2 other women that I want to share. First off is Mary Virginia Merrick, who was very influential, and I can see Katie smiling. She was born in Washington, D.C. in 1866 to a very successful family there in D.C. Her father was one of the founding members of the Georgetown University Law Center. Her great uncle, who was a priest, had been the president of Georgetown University. She came from a very successful Washington, D.C. family. And she was very devout in her upbringing, wanted to herself become a sister of charity, following after the footsteps of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. But due to contracting tuberculosis, her health quickly began to deteriorate as she was only in her teens. But after her parents died, I believe when she was 18, when she was only 19 or 20 years old, she established the Christ Child Society in 1887. And you can only imagine, losing her parents just a year or 2 before, wanting to care for, and she herself having to care for her siblings, wanting to go out of her way even more to care for children, care for families, care for people who had nothing. She started off by just simply sewing small pieces of cloth that she could share with children, that she could share with infants, that she could share with families. And then quickly her society grew, and it's become a national and very influential organization. And she continued in her efforts until her death in 1955. And she herself is on the way of becoming a saint one day, as her cause was opened in 2011. So I believe she's actually Venerable or Servant of God Mary Virginia Merrick. so we can ask for her intercession if we desire to care for particularly children or families as she did in the Christ Child Society. Now, the last woman I want to talk about, and this certainly doesn't exhaust everything that could be said. I even had to skip over some. But the last one I'm going to cover is very influential both in the church and in society. So she covers a number of areas. And that's Dorothy Day. Maybe you're a little bit familiar with her already. She was born in 1897, and besides being a great mover in social justice, besides being a figure in nonviolence movements, even running into some trouble as in her younger years as an anarchist and going through different struggles. She found her way back to the faith and became very devout, and her faith very much influenced her views and ideas, but she's best known for being the co-founder of the Catholic Worker newspaper and the Catholic Worker movement, as it's been called. And the Catholic Worker movement is really all about working for social justice, working for equalities, for Catholic social teaching, aid for the poor, nonviolence. One of my favorite stories, because Dorothy Day is often maybe seen as a radical figure and maybe somebody who, some might question how much faith did she really have. It seemed like she was really involved in all these social justice things, kind of these far out ideas. What faith did she have? Did it really match up to what she was saying? And one of the stories goes, part of the Catholic Worker movement is they would have Catholic worker homes in different cities throughout the United States, and where she was living, and they would regularly have priests come and have mass in their houses. And one day a priest decided to come without a chalice, and so somebody in the house just grabbed a coffee mug from the cabinet, gave it to the priest to use as a chalice. And after the mass was over, Dorothy Day took the chalice, cleaned it meticulously, and then put it into a pillowcase and smashed it and buried it in the ground. And everyone asked her, what are you doing? That was a perfectly good coffee cup. And she said, once it has touched the blood of Christ, it can never be a coffee cup again. And she didn't want it to be used as a coffee cup again, because she knew that the Eucharist was so important, that it had that much influence. And it was precisely that faith of hers, that faith in the Eucharist, that faith in the justice that Christ has come to give us, that is what spurred her desire to work for the poor, to work for social justice, to work in all these areas. And as well, she died in 1980, and her cause for sainthood has been opened. So again, we can look for her we can look to her not only for inspiration, but we can ask for her intercession, as we desire to open our hearts all the more to Christ and the poor, to Christ and the outcast, to Christ who in those who face, injustice and oppression. So this last hour and a half has been, like I said, both a very surface level and a little bit of a deep dive into just a small sliver of the influence that women have had in the Catholic Church here in the U.S. And so I really hope that this has been an opportunity for you to appreciate not only, again, some of the struggles that the Church has gone through, but also the great work that particularly women have and continue to have in our church. And the handout that you received, I have it in the slides here as well. But as I mentioned, there's 7 women saints in the American church. There's 2 blesseds who I didn't even go into anything about. Blessed Maria Francisca Shkevir and Blessed Teresa Demjanovic. And besides them, there's numerous venerables And as you can see from your sheet, lots and lots and lots of servants of God. So lots of women who have some connection to the American Catholic Church, who are on their way to becoming saints, who are on their way to being these great saints like the 7 women before them are held up. They too one day might be listed as saints, and we can always ask for their intercession. So this comes to the end of our discussion. I'm happy to answer some questions afterwards. But as I always do on my final note, I want to end us with just a little preview, plug, and encouragement for next month's talk, which is we're going back to the historical time periods of the American Catholic Church, and we're going to talk about Catholics on the frontier. So as the nation is expanding, so is our church. So I look forward to seeing you for that on April 15th. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you for Awakening for co-sponsoring this event. And I really hope that it was a great time, as much it was for me as it is for all of you. So thank you and God bless.